The ship floated quietly in the vast emptiness of space, its hull scarred by years of wear and tear. Inside, Captain Elias Kane leaned back in his pilot's chair, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and his other hand lazily scrolling through his onboard computer. The hum of the engines was his only company, as it always was. He liked it that way, alone, away from the noise and chaos of crowded stations and people's endless problems. But today, something felt off. A soft, rhythmic beeping broke the monotony of his solitude. Elias sat up straight, his attention shifting to the old receiver on the console. It wasn't often that his equipment, half of which was held together by duct tape and luck, picked up anything. Most signals in this part of space were just echoes of dying satellites or static interference. This, however, was different. Elias frowned, his brows knitting together. The signal wasn't random. It had a pattern, and beneath the static, there was something, words maybe. He twisted the knobs, fine-tuning the receiver. The beeping grew louder, and for a moment, he swore he heard a voice. Help. Dying. Please. He froze, unsure if he had imagined it. Then it came again, faint but clear enough to make his heart race. Someone was out there, and they were in trouble. Elias hesitated. This was a dangerous sector, abandoned for years after a mining operation went terribly wrong. Ships that ventured here often didn't return. The locals whispered about cursed planets and ghosts of the miners, but Elias had never believed in such things. Still, logic told him to ignore the signal, to keep moving and stay safe. But something tugged at him. A voice, desperate and pleading, was hard to ignore. All right, let's see where you're coming from, Elias muttered, his fingers dancing across the console. The ship's scanners pinpointed the source. A small, barren planet on the edge of the sector. Its name popped up on his screen. Meridian 5. Quarantined. No life signs recorded. He exhaled sharply. Of course, it's a dead rock. Elias stared at the screen, debating his next move. He didn't owe anyone anything, especially not a faceless voice on a dying signal. But the thought of leaving someone to suffer, alone and forgotten, twisted something in his gut. He downed the rest of his coffee, slammed the cup onto the console, and powered up the engines. Guess we're going on a little detour, he muttered to himself. As he approached Meridian 5, the planet came into view on his monitor. It was desolate, its surface a jagged mix of rocks and craters. Clouds of dust swirled in the thin atmosphere, giving it an eerie, lifeless appearance. Elias could see why no one bothered coming here. He entered the coordinates of the signal source, guiding his ship through the atmosphere. The ride was rough, the turbulence rattling every bolt in his aging vessel. Finally, he spotted a clearing and landed, the ship settling with a metallic groan. Elias grabbed his gear, a handheld scanner, a basic translator, and his trusty plasma cutter, and stepped out into the dusty air. The silence was overwhelming. No wind, no sounds of wildlife, nothing but the crunch of his boots on the rocky ground. The scanner led him to a strange structure half buried in the dirt. It was a massive cube, its surface smooth and black, reflecting no light. It didn't look natural, nor did it resemble any mining equipment he'd ever seen. Interesting, Elias murmured, running a gloved hand across the surface. The material was cold, almost unnaturally so. His scanner beeped rapidly, confirming the signal was coming from inside. He circled the cube, looking for an entrance or some kind of control panel, but found none. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't meant to be easily accessed. He pulled out his plasma cutter, the tool sparking to life with a sharp hiss. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding," he said. As he worked, the signal grew stronger. The faint voice from earlier began to echo in his ears, now clearer than before. It was a woman's voice, speaking in a language he didn't understand. His translator picked up fragments. Trapped. Help. Dying. The urgency in the voice made Elias work faster. The plasma cutter carved into the cube, the thick material resisting his efforts. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cold air around him. Finally, after what felt like hours, he breached the surface. A wave of energy pulsed out, knocking him back. He scrambled to his feet, coughing, and peered into the opening. Inside was a chamber glowing with faint blue light. And there, suspended in the middle, was a figure. It was a woman, alien, by the looks of her. Her features were delicate, her skin a pale, shimmering silver. She was unconscious, her body floating as if held by invisible strings. Elias's heart pounded. He had expected a lot of things, but not this. "Well," he said, staring at the alien woman, "this just got interesting." Elias Kane stood frozen, his eyes locked on the alien woman suspended in the faint blue glow. She looked fragile, like a sculpture made of silver and light. Her chest rose and fell slightly, showing she was still alive. Barely. "What are you doing here?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. The inside of the black box was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Strange symbols and intricate patterns covered the walls, pulsating faintly as if the entire structure were alive. The hum of energy was steady and low, almost like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Elias hesitated before stepping closer to the chamber. He wasn't sure if touching anything would trigger some alien defense mechanism or worse, harm the woman inside. Still, he couldn't just leave her. She was clearly in distress, and the voice he'd heard earlier had been hers. He took out his handheld scanner and began running it over the chamber. The readings made no sense. Energy levels spiked and dipped erratically, and the materials used to build the device weren't listed in his database. Whatever this was, it was advanced, far beyond human technology. The translator on his belt crackled to life. A faint voice whispered through the static. "Please, help me. They'll come back." Elias frowned. The translator only caught fragments, but it was enough to confirm her fear. Whoever had left her here might return, and if they were powerful enough to create something like this black box, he didn't want to meet them. "All right, let's get you out of there," he said, setting his plasma cutter against the chamber surface. The cutter sparked to life, carving into the glowing material. The energy pulsing through the chamber resisted him at first, but Elias was persistent. As he worked, he noticed the blue glow dimming, and the hum of the structure grew louder, almost like a warning. "Come on, don't blow up on me," he muttered, gritting his teeth. Finally, the chamber cracked open with a sharp hiss, and the blue light flickered out. The alien woman fell forward, her body limp. Elias dropped his cutter and caught her just before she hit the ground. She was light, almost unnaturally so, and her skin felt cold to the touch. Up close, her features were even more striking. Large, shimmering eyes that fluttered open as she weakly tried to focus on him. "Who?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Easy there," Elias said softly. "I'm getting you out of here. You're safe now." Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She closed her eyes again, her body going limp in his arms. Elias felt a pang of worry. She didn't have much time. He carried her back to his ship, moving as quickly as he could across the rocky terrain. The black box behind him emitted a low, ominous hum, and he didn't want to stick around to find out what it meant. Once inside the ship, Elias placed her on a medical cot in the small infirmary. He hooked her up to the basic life support system, watching as the machine worked to stabilize her vitals. The readings were erratic. Her physiology was unlike anything the system was designed for, but it was better than nothing. Elias sat down beside her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "All right, now what?" he muttered. His onboard computer chirped, and a warning flashed on the screen. It was a proximity alert. Something was approaching the planet. Elias's stomach sank. He ran to the cockpit and checked the scanners. 3 ships had entered the atmosphere, their designs sleek and menacing. They were heading straight for the black box. "Of course," he muttered, his hands flying over the controls. He powered up the engines, ready to take off. But then he hesitated. If those ships were after the black box, they might scan the planet and find his ship as well. He needed to leave now, but moving too soon could draw attention. The alien woman's voice echoed in his mind. They'll come back. Elias cursed under his breath. He couldn't let her fall into their hands again. Whoever they were, they'd abandoned her to die. And that told him all he needed to know about their intentions. Guess we're doing this the hard way, he said, gripping the controls. The ships landed near the black box, their lights cutting through the swirling dust. Elias activated his ship's stealth systems, a cobbled-together feature he built from salvaged parts. It wasn't perfect, but it might give him enough time to escape unnoticed. He glanced back at the infirmary. The alien woman was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Hang in there, he said quietly. As the enemy ships began scanning the area, Elias guided his ship into the sky, keeping low and slow to avoid detection. The hum of his engines was barely audible over his pounding heartbeat. For now, they were safe, but he knew it wouldn't last. The ship trembled slightly as Elias guided it through the atmosphere, the planet's surface shrinking in the rear camera. He glanced at the scanners, watching the 3 enemy ships near the black box. For now, they seemed unaware of his escape, but he knew that wouldn't last. The alien woman, still unconscious, lay on the medical cot behind him. Her breathing had evened out, but her skin remained cold and pale. Elias checked the life support system. Her vitals were stable, but barely. He had bought her time, but she needed proper medical care, and soon. First things first, Elias muttered, activating the ship's cloaking systems. The stealth feature flickered to life, masking his ship's energy signature. It wasn't foolproof, but it would make him harder to track. The proximity alarm blared again, and Elias swore under his breath. The enemy ships had picked up movement. On the screen, one of the vessels veered away from the black box, heading straight for him. Guess they're not as dumb as they look, he said, gripping the controls. The ship jolted as laser fire streaked past. Elias slammed the throttle forward, pushing his aging vessel to its limits. The engines roared in protest, but they held. He darted between rocky outcrops and debris fields, using the planet's rough terrain to his advantage. Come on, you piece of junk, don't give up on me now, he muttered, glancing at the flickering engine readings. The enemy ship closed the distance, its sleek design built for speed. Elias cursed, realizing he couldn't outrun it. Not in this state. His fingers danced across the console, activating countermeasures. A burst of flares shot from his ship, blinding the pursuer's sensors. The momentary distraction gave him an opening. Elias dove into a nearby canyon, the narrow walls closing in on either side. The enemy ship followed, its weapons lighting up the dark passage. Rocks and debris rained down as explosions echoed behind him. Elias gritted his teeth, maneuvering through the twisting canyon with practiced precision. Years of scavenging in dangerous zones had honed his piloting skills, and he needed every bit of that experience now. The enemy ship's fire grazed his hull, sending a shudder through the vessel. Alarms blared, warning of a minor hull breach. Elias ignored them, focusing on the path ahead. Suddenly, the canyon opened up into a vast underground cavern. Elias spotted a narrow crevice near the far wall, just big enough for his ship. Without hesitation, he aimed for it, shutting down the engines at the last moment to slide silently into the hidden space. He held his breath as the enemy ship entered the cavern, its searchlights sweeping across the rocks. The lights passed over his hiding spot, but didn't stop. After a tense minute, the enemy ship gave up and flew out of the cavern, returning to the black box. Elias exhaled deeply, his hands shaking as he powered the ship back up. Too close, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He guided the ship out of the crevice and back toward open space. The scanners showed no immediate pursuit, but Elias knew it was only a matter of time before they traced his trajectory. He needed to get far away from this sector, and fast. Back in the infirmary, the alien woman stirred. Her fingers twitched and her eyes fluttered open. Elias noticed and rushed to her side. "You're awake," he said, keeping his voice calm. Her gaze was unfocused at first, but then her eyes locked onto his. They were a shimmering silver, filled with a mix of fear and confusion. She tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. "Easy," Elias said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've been through a lot. Just rest." She spoke, her voice soft and melodic, but the language was unfamiliar. The translator on Elias's belt activated, catching fragments of her words. "Who are you? Why? Help." "My name's Elias," he said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I heard your signal. I couldn't just leave you there." She frowned, as if struggling to process his words. "Signal. Trap. They'll come." "I know," Elias said grimly. "They're already looking for us. But they won't find us. Not if I can help it." The alien woman's expression softened, a flicker of trust in her eyes. She said something else, but the translator failed to catch it. Her voice trailed off, and she drifted back into unconsciousness. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're just full of surprises, aren't you?" He returned to the cockpit, setting a course for the nearest neutral space station. It was a long shot, but it was the only place he could think of to lay low and get her the help she needed. As the ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Whoever she was, and whatever secret she carried, they were worth risking everything. For now, all he could do was keep moving, and hope they stayed one step ahead. Elias stared at the star map glowing on the cockpit screen. The neutral station, Haven Outpost, was still several hours away. It wasn't much, just a small hub on the edge of human-controlled space, but it was his best chance to get medical help for the alien woman. He glanced back at the infirmary. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Her silver skin caught the faint glow of the life support machine, making her look almost otherworldly. Well, she was otherworldly, Elias reminded himself. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. What did I get myself into? The ship's proximity alarm jolted him upright. He checked the scanners, his stomach sinking. A single ship had entered the system behind him, sleek and fast. It matched the design of the ones near the black box. "Guess they didn't lose me after all," Elias muttered. He powered up the engines, pushing his ship toward its limits. The enemy vessel gained on him, its weapons locking onto his trajectory. Elias cursed under his breath. His stealth system had bought him time, but it wasn't enough to completely evade them. The ship shuddered as a warning shot grazed the hull. Elias's hands flew across the controls, activating defensive measures. A series of flares launched from his ship, blinding the pursuer's sensors. For a moment, the enemy ship hesitated, giving Elias a slim chance to maneuver. "Come on, old girl, hold it together," he muttered, coaxing the ship into a tight spiral. The enemy vessel recovered quickly, its weapons lighting up again. Elias's ship rattled as another shot hit, this one closer to the engines. Alarms blared, and smoke began to fill the cockpit. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He couldn't outgun them, and his ship was too damaged to outrun them. That left only one option, outsmarting them. Elias scanned the nearby space and spotted a dense asteroid field. It was a risky move, but it was better than being blasted out of the sky. He veered toward the field, weaving between massive, spinning rocks. The enemy ship followed, its sleek design giving it an edge in maneuverability. But Elias had an advantage too. Years of experience flying through dangerous terrain. The cockpit filled with tense silence, broken only by the sound of his breathing and the constant beeping of the scanners. He dipped and swerved, using the asteroids as cover. The enemy ship fired repeatedly, its shots missing by inches. Suddenly, an idea sparked in Elias's mind. He spotted a massive asteroid ahead, its surface jagged and uneven. He pushed his ship toward it, skimming just above its surface. As the enemy ship closed in, Elias triggered a timed explosive he had installed on his ship for emergencies. He dropped it behind him, timing it perfectly as he veered away from the asteroid. The explosion tore through space, sending a shockwave that shattered smaller asteroids and knocked the enemy ship off course. Elias watched on his scanner as the hostile vessel spun out of control, colliding with a chunk of rock. It erupted in a fiery burst, and the blip disappeared from his screen. Elias slumped back in his chair, letting out a shaky breath. That was too close. He powered down the alarms and checked the damage. The hull was battered, and one engine was running at half capacity, but the ship was still flying. For now, that was enough. He turned his attention back to the infirmary. The alien woman was still unconscious, but her breathing seemed steadier. He placed a hand on the doorframe, watching her. "Who are you?" he murmured. "And why are they so desperate to get you back?" The translator on his belt crackled again, catching faint whispers from her lips. She was speaking in her sleep, her voice soft and broken. The translator struggled to keep up, but two words came through clearly. "Kalira, danger. Kalira." Elias repeated, testing the name. It suited her, mysterious, yet strong. He returned to the cockpit, setting the ship back on course for Haven Outpost. The star map glowed faintly, the neutral station now closer but still hours away. As the ship sailed through the emptiness of space, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. Whoever had built that black box and left Kalira to die wouldn't give up so easily. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "If they want her, they'll have to go through me first." Elias tightened his grip on the controls, the faint hum of the ship's engines his only company. Somewhere out there, enemies lurked in the shadows, waiting for their chance. But Elias Kane had made a decision. He wasn't just running anymore. He was ready to fight. Elias pushed his damaged ship through the cold silence of space, his mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. The asteroid field had bought him time, but the enemy would send more ships. They wanted Kalira, and if they were willing to send a fleet to a quarantine planet, it meant she was valuable, dangerously so. He glanced back at the infirmary, where Kalira lay on the medical cot. She was still unconscious, but her breathing was steadier, her silver skin glowing faintly under the soft lights of the ship. "Hang in there," Elias said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The proximity alarm blared again, making his heart skip a beat. He slammed his hand on the console, silencing the noise, and checked the scanners. Another ship, smaller and faster, was closing in on his position. "Damn it," Elias muttered, gripping the controls. "They just don't quit, do they?" The ship was too close for him to outrun, and his stealth systems were still recharging. Fighting wasn't an option, not in his current state. He needed another plan. Fast. Elias scanned the star map for nearby locations. A debris field from an ancient space battle appeared on the screen, a graveyard of old, abandoned ships and wreckage. It was risky, but it offered cover. "Looks like we're taking a detour," he said, steering the ship toward the debris field. As he approached, the field came into view, a chaotic mess of twisted metal, shattered hulls, and drifting cargo containers. The remains of battles fought long ago floated silently in the void, a grim reminder of the cost of war. Elias maneuvered his ship into the heart of the wreckage, weaving between massive chunks of broken starships. He powered down the engines to reduce his energy signature, letting the ship drift. The enemy vessel entered the field moments later, its searchlights sweeping over the debris. "Let's see how good you are at hide and seek," Elias muttered under his breath. The enemy ship moved cautiously, scanning each piece of wreckage as it passed. Elias held his breath, his hands gripping the controls tightly. He watched the scanners, waiting for the right moment. The enemy ship drifted closer, its lights passing over Elias's vessel. He froze, his heart pounding as the beam lingered for a moment. But then the lights moved on, and the enemy ship continued its search. Elias exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He needed a distraction, something to draw the enemy away from him. His eyes landed on a derelict cruiser floating nearby, its hull riddled with holes. "That'll do," he said, a plan forming in his mind. Using a remote drone, Elias guided an old explosive charge toward the cruiser. He positioned it near the engine bay, where the reactor would have been, and set a timer. The enemy ship was still scanning the field, unaware of the trap. The timer ticked down, and Elias braced himself. The explosion lit up the debris field, sending a shockwave that rattled his ship. Pieces of the cruiser scattered in all directions, and the enemy vessel veered sharply to avoid the blast. Elias used the chaos to his advantage. He powered up the engines just enough to slip away, staying low and weaving through the wreckage. The enemy ship, now distracted by the explosion, didn't notice his departure. Once clear of the debris field, Elias set a course for Haven Outpost. The star map showed it was less than an hour away. Back in the infirmary, Kalira stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Elias hurried to her side, relief washing over him. "Hey," he said gently, "you're awake." Kalira's gaze was unfocused, her voice weak. "Where am I?" "You're on my ship," Elias explained. "I found you in that black box. You're safe now." Her eyes widened, and she tried to sit up, but Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, gently pushing her back down. "Easy," he said. "You've been through a lot." Kalira's breathing quickened, and she clutched his arm. "They're coming. They won't stop." "I know," Elias said, his voice steady. "But I won't let them take you." Kalira stared at him, her silver eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Why are you helping me?" Elias hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Because leaving you there didn't feel right. You deserve a chance." Her grip on his arm loosened, and her expression softened. For the first time, she looked at him not as a stranger, but as someone she could trust. "We're almost at a safe place," Elias continued. "Just hang on a little longer." Kalira nodded weakly, her eyes closing again. Elias returned to the cockpit, his determination hardening. The outpost was within reach, but so was the enemy. He had no doubt they would try again. But Elias Kane wasn't about to back down. Not now, and not ever. The Haven Outpost came into view, its massive structure floating in the endless darkness of space. It wasn't much. A station patched together from old ships and forgotten parts. But to Elias, it looked like a sanctuary. For now, it was the safest place he could take Kalira. "Almost there," he muttered, glancing back at the infirmary where she lay resting. Her breathing was steadier, but her face still bore the traces of exhaustion. The ship's communicator crackled to life as he approached. A gruff voice came through. "Unidentified vessel, state your business." Elias hit the transmitter button. "This is Captain Elias Kane. I'm requesting emergency docking. Got someone who needs medical attention." The voice paused, and Elias imagined the operator scanning his beaten-up ship. "Permission granted. Dock at basics. Don't cause trouble." "Wouldn't dream of it," Elias replied with a smirk. He guided his ship toward the docking bay, the station's automated arms locking it into place. As the airlock hissed open, Elias grabbed his gear and prepared to move Kalira. He wrapped her in a thermal blanket, her body light and delicate as he carried her into the station. The docking bay was bustling with activity. Merchants unloading goods, mechanics fixing ships, and travelers rushing to their destinations. Elias moved quickly, keeping Kalira hidden under the blanket. He didn't want to attract attention, especially not from anyone who might recognize her. He found the station's medical wing, a small but clean facility run by an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "What happened to her?" the medic asked, glancing at Kalira. "Long story," Elias said. "Can you help her?" The medic frowned, but nodded. "I'll do what I can. Put her on the bed over there." Elias laid Kalira down gently, watching as the medic connected her to various monitors. The readings flashed on the screen, showing data that made no sense to Elias. "This isn't a species I recognize," the medic muttered. "Where did you find her?" "Let's just say she was left in a bad place," Elias replied, avoiding the full truth. "Can you stabilize her?" "I'll try," the medic said. "But whoever she is, she's not out of danger yet." Elias nodded, stepping back to let the medic work. He leaned against the wall, his mind racing. He brought Kalira to safety, but he knew it wouldn't last. The people chasing her wouldn't stop, and he put the entire outpost at risk by bringing her here. The station's intercom crackled, announcing the arrival of a new ship. Elias tensed, his instincts kicking in. He left the medical wing and headed for the observation deck, his boots echoing in the metal corridors. From the deck, he watched as a sleek, black ship docked at the station. It matched the design of the enemy vessels he'd encountered earlier. "Great," Elias muttered, his jaw tightening. A group of armed individuals disembarked, their movements sharp and coordinated. They didn't look like merchants or travelers. They were hunters, and they were here for Kalira. Elias moved quickly, making his way back to the medical wing. The medic looked up as he entered, her expression questioning. "Trouble's here," Elias said bluntly. The medic's eyes narrowed. "Whoever's after her, you'd better not let them bring their fight into my station." "I'll handle it," Elias promised, his tone firm. Kalira stirred on the bed, her eyes opening slowly. She looked at Elias, her expression filled with worry. "They found us," she said weakly, her voice trembling. "I know," Elias replied, his voice steady. "But they're not taking you. Not while I'm here." Kalira's hand reached out, grasping his arm. "You can't fight them alone. They're too powerful." Elias gave a small smile. "I've been outnumbered before. Doesn't mean I'm giving up." He turned to the medic. "Keep her here. Don't let anyone in unless it's me." The medic nodded, her expression grim. "You'd better survive, Kane. I don't want this mess spilling into my station." Elias left the medical wing, his mind focused. He didn't have much, an old blaster, a few smoke grenades, and his wits, but he'd made do with less before. He found a vantage point overlooking the docking bay, watching as the hunters spread out. They were searching methodically, questioning anyone who looked suspicious. Elias took a deep breath, his mind running through possible strategies. He needed to draw them away from the medical wing, buy Kalira time to recover. Reaching into his pocket, he activated a small signal jammer he'd salvaged years ago. It wasn't perfect, but it would disrupt their communications long enough to cause confusion. The hunters paused as their devices crackled and went dark. Elias smirked, aiming his blaster at a nearby fuel canister. With a single shot, the canister exploded, sending a wave of chaos through the docking bay. "Come and get me," Elias muttered, disappearing into the shadows. The explosion rattled the docking bay, and shouts echoed through the station as smoke filled the air. Elias darted through the chaos, keeping low and using the shadows to his advantage. The hunters were scrambling, their search pattern disrupted. Elias knew he had little time. They would regroup quickly, and once they realized he was drawing them away from Kalira, they'd come for the medical wing. He had to keep them chasing him for as long as possible. He sprinted down a narrow corridor, his boots pounding against the metal floor. Behind him, he could hear the hunters barking orders, their footsteps closing in. Elias smirked, pulling the smoke grenade from his belt and tossing it behind him. The corridor filled with thick gray smoke, giving him a few precious seconds to slip into a maintenance shaft. He climbed swiftly, his muscles burning, and emerged onto a higher level overlooking the main docking area. From here, he could see the hunters regrouping, their leader barking commands. Elias pulled out his blaster and took aim at a stack of cargo crates near their position. With a sharp crack, the crates exploded, sending debris flying. The hunters scattered, their formation breaking again. "Come on," Elias muttered under his breath. Keep chasing me. He moved quickly, leading them deeper into the station. Each step was calculated. Another distraction, another delay. He knew the layout of Haven Outpost well enough to create a maze for his pursuers, but he also knew he couldn't keep this up forever. As he rounded a corner, he nearly ran into one of the hunters. The alien, tall and armored, reacted quickly, raising its weapon. Elias ducked just in time, the blast scorching the wall behind him. He rolled to the side, firing his blaster. The shot hit the hunter's arm, causing it to drop its weapon with a grunt of pain. Elias didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned and ran, his heart pounding. The hunters were relentless, but so was Elias. Every move he made was designed to buy time for Kalira. He couldn't fight them all, but he could keep them off her trail. Finally, Elias found himself cornered in a storage room. The door slammed shut behind him, and he cursed under his breath. There was no other exit. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and the door creaked open. The hunters entered cautiously, their weapons raised. Elias stood with his hands up, a calm expression on his face. "Looking for me?" he said, his voice steady. The leader, a towering alien with glowing eyes, stepped forward. "Where is she?" Elias smirked. "Far away from here by now." The leader's eyes narrowed, but before it could respond, Elias pressed a hidden button on his belt. The room filled with a blinding flash of light and a deafening bang. When the hunters recovered, Elias was gone. He had slipped into another maintenance shaft, his heart racing. He moved quickly, knowing he had only a few minutes before they caught up. He emerged near the medical wing, his blaster drawn. The medic looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of relief and anger. "You're insane," she said. "Yeah, I get that a lot," Elias replied, moving to Kalira's side. She was awake now, her eyes clearer but filled with worry. You're hurt," she said, noticing a burn on his arm. "Just a scratch," Elias said, brushing it off. "We need to get out of here. Now." Kalira nodded weakly, trying to sit up. Elias helped her, his movements gentle but quick. He glanced at the medic. "Thanks for your help, but we got to go." "Just don't bring them back here," the medic said, waving them off. Elias carried Kalira back to his ship, moving through the quieter corridors of the station. The hunters were still searching, but they hadn't reached this area yet. As they boarded the ship, Elias set Kalira down in a seat and powered up the engines. The ship groaned to life, and he guided it out of the docking bay. The hunters spotted them just as they exited, their ships launching in pursuit. Elias pushed the throttle to full, the damaged engines straining but holding. "Hold on," he said to Kalira. The enemy ships closed in, their weapons lighting up the void. Elias maneuvered sharply, dodging their fire. He activated his last countermeasure, a burst of electromagnetic energy that disrupted their systems. The enemy ships faltered, their lights flickering. Elias took the opportunity to jump to faster-than-light travel, the stars stretching into lines as they sped away. Kalira looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. "You saved me." Elias shrugged, a small smile on his lips. "It's what I do." She leaned back, her body relaxing for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias glanced at her, his expression softening. "You're safe now, but we're not done yet. Whoever's after you isn't going to give up." Kalira nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "Then we'll face them together." Elias smirked. "Together, huh? I like the sound of that." The ship sailed into the unknown, carrying them toward whatever came next.